I've been lucky enough over the course of my YouTube career to have companies send me gear, and it's been a while since I've reviewed most of it. Here's what I think of it now. What's up, and welcome back to Gabe Miller Music. This is an idea stolen with permission from Freebeat. I'll leave his channel link at the end of this video. But essentially, I always want to be consumer focused first. I've used and then subsequently reviewed quite a bit more gear than the average person and have been able to work with the companies that make it. But I always want to make sure I take a real user approach. So, it's been long enough since most of this gear has entered my collection, so let's just go through it bit by bit. Starting with the Arturia Microlab. This was part of a deal that I did with them to cover their software synth Pigments 2. It got the granular update quite a while back, and it was the first time that like a big company reached out to me, which was awesome. And also on the software synth side of things, I do still use Pigments 2, especially after the latest update, which they included me in the release of. I don't use it as much for like heavy bass design. I still go to Serum for that mostly and a bit of Vital, but for big, pretty sounds, I adore Pigments and still use it. Although, to be clear, these days I'm making a lot more stuff with hardware than with software, and so when it comes to plugins, I'm mostly using effects plugins. Which actually, this is a tangent of a tangent, but Baby Audio has been awesome about sending me plugins, and their effects plugins are ones I use all the time, especially Spaced Out, which is a combination reverb and delay. I use that on pretty much every single song. But to get back to the Microlab, Arturia sent this to me along with a surprise synth, which I'll get to in a second. But as far as MIDI controllers go, it is fine. I do use it as my primary USB keyboard controller. You know, it's just a pretty standard mini key keyboard. It feels fine to play, although I'm not a piano player, so this is everything I need it to be, really. It's just a simple, compact keyboard controller, and that's pretty much exactly what I need, so I keep it around. I do want to mention a point that counts both for and against it. The cable to it is like integrated into the keyboard. So the body of the keyboard actually has this ridge in it, and it like envelops this, and this kind of snaps into place, which is cool. But of course, if you ever want to like, you know, take out the cable, you have to put it back afterwards if you want to like take advantage of that. And if you wanted to swap out the cable, you'd probably want something that's like pretty much exactly the same, or else you lose one of the quirks of the keyboard. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but for me, it's perfectly adequate. Basic shift and hold, octave up and down, and then some kind of proprietary controls for their stuff. See, this is the annoying part. But along with the Microlab, Arturia surprised me by sending over the Microfreak, which at the time, that was huge for me. Like, I had my eye on that synth at the time. It looked super interesting, but I didn't have the money for it. Like, YouTube wasn't bringing in nearly enough money to justify regular purchases of new gear. And they sent it over, and that was super exciting for me, and I have gotten a ton of use out of it since. It's genuinely still one of my favorite synths that I own. It is weird. I'll lead with that. It's a bit of a weird sounding synth, but the user interface is fantastic, and it gives you a lot of different sound sources to work with, and they keep adding new firmware updates that have expanded its abilities, including the latest one adding custom wavetables. Note, I would never ever buy new music production gear based on potential future firmware updates, but I definitely would buy new gear based on all of the new power it's gained from previous firmware updates. Hopefully that makes sense. Regardless, the sound of the Microfreak is fairly specific, and not everyone's going to like it. Sometimes it's a little harsh, or even, I guess, a little bit nasally, if that makes sense. There's just some stuff going on in the upper mids that doesn't always make for the most pleasing sound. But despite it sounding a bit unconventional or even a bit unpleasant, I still have had no trouble getting a ton of great sounds out of it. I've not only used it an absolute ton in hardware jams, but I've also just had a lot of fun designing patches on it and then multi-sampling them into my MPC-1, which I then proceed to use a bunch. Everything from aggressive basses to cold, icy pads and leads and shimmery stuff, and then also some kind of traditional, more subtractive synthesis type stuff too with the analog filter. I've gotten so much use out of this synth, and I still feel like I've not even scratched the surface of what it's capable of. I would definitely listen to a ton of sound demos and try to get some hands on it before getting one yourself, because even though I love it, I can't recommend it to everyone. Some people will say it's super overrated or that it just straight up sucks. And since sound is subjective, I'll even grant them that. But personally, I really enjoy it. For me, it's kind of the closest thing to like a hands-on version of soft synths like Serum or Pigments. Obviously, it sounds a whole lot more rough around the edges than those synths, but also that's some of its appeal. Up next are the Novation circuits. Novation was awesome enough to include me in the launches of both, and they are still to this day some of my most used pieces of gear. I did a dedicated video recently-ish re-reviewing both circuits, so I'll link that at the end of this video and won't go into it too deeply, but I liked them quite a bit at launch, and honestly, I've only grown to like them more since. They're still some of the ones that I just immediately reach for to just casually make beats off camera just for my own personal enjoyment. There are absolutely some annoyances that I've run into over time. Of course, having only monophonic tracks on the circuit rhythm is a huge bummer and very much a deal breaker for some people. And while the circuit tracks is mostly great for controlling external gear and processing its sound, it does introduce some latency in that pipeline, and that is a bit of a bummer and something I didn't notice immediately at launch. But long term, these have been some of my favorite devices, especially the tracks, and if either of them were to be like stolen or damaged somehow, I would probably not even hit up Novation. I'd probably just buy new ones myself at this point. Once again, if you want more details on those, check out my full re-review of them. That'll link at the end of this video. But let's move on to the hologram microcosm. This is a bit of a weird one because it's very much an expensive device, especially for what it does. It's a reverb and delay and glitch and looping pedal, which given that might make the price seem pretty steep. And especially at the beginning, I wouldn't have bought one for myself, but I was very interested to try it out. And now it's a bit of a ritual of mine to, anytime I get a new synth, pipe it through the Microfreak and make some big ambient soundscapey music, which is something I didn't even think I was capable of at first, which is why I'm really, really glad it's in my arsenal. I'm still a bit on the fence as to whether I would buy a new one for myself, but it's basically unlocked the ability to make ambient music, which before that was just kind of like witchcraft to me. So I do really enjoy it. I'm really glad they sent one over, and once again, I acknowledge that the price is steep. It's definitely a luxury for most synth users to have in their arsenal, but I'm really glad to have one. I have gotten quite a bit of use out of it, but I do want to put the very important caveat that I've had to go out of my way to use it. It's not really cleanly integrated into my setup. Like, I don't find myself piping software synths through it for like post-processing. I don't really find myself integrating it into like bigger hardware setups. I pretty much only use it by itself with one synth plugged into it. That's the sweet spot for me, and I feel comfortable having it in that very narrow use case because I didn't have to pay for it. And I want to be very upfront with that. So it's definitely not for everyone. I have a pretty narrow use case for it myself, but if that use case fits what you're looking for and you don't mind burning the cash on it, it is a good bet. Up next is the MPC Studio. Technically, it's the MPC Studio 2, but Akai is just calling it the MPC Studio, so here we are. This is basically their answer to the Machine Micro. It's a fairly compact MIDI controller that controls the MPC software, and those are very much built for each other. So the idea is that you get into the MPC ecosystem at a big discount from buying a standalone device, and you have all the hardware control that you'd want, or at least most of the hardware control that you would want to control the software, and you get the full MPC experience for not a lot of money, which is why I was quite receptive to it when it dropped. I was part of the launch, as was every other YouTuber and their dog, but you might notice that usage of it since it dropped has gone off a cliff. Probably because a lot of the YouTubers that Akai sent it to are also standalone MPC users, and if we have standalone MPCs, we're not going to use the kind of nerfed, like, controlled or computer interface version. Like, the standalone experience is just a lot better. So to be clear, if you want to get into the MPC ecosystem but can't spring for the more expensive option, I still recommend the MPC Studio. It's a pretty well-built device. It gets you the proper MPC experience, including like a hardware-software interface for multi-sampling, which is really nice. I'm really glad they included that because that's one of my favorite MPC features. If that's you, then I still recommend it. But it definitely can't beat the standalone experience. So if you're already an MPC user using any of the standalones, you can just skip this entirely. And I still have mine, but I genuinely haven't used it since I initially covered it in the first couple of videos. This is Gabe from the future. I realized like a week after filming this that I completely forgot to mention one additional piece of gear. That is the Rolly block. And that's probably because I haven't used it in a while. This is kind of a weird device to try to categorize because it's sold for one thing and I actually think it's better for another thing. Let me explain. Its main gimmick is that it offers different kind of modes of expressiveness beyond just playing pads. So in addition to like velocity sensitivity, you can also exert different amounts of pressure. You can move your finger around to do like pitch bends and vibrato and that kind of stuff. So it's kind of expressive, which is kind of cool. What I actually like it for is the fact that it is one of the smallest commercially available MIDI controllers, and it's actually pretty good at being a small, flexible MIDI controller. For like a year and a half, this just lived in my backpack, and anytime I find myself with a little bit of time, maybe I was in a cafe studying and wanted to switch to working on some tunes, I could just plug this into my computer via USB-C and go. Super nice to have. I really enjoyed it for that, but lately I haven't really felt the need for it, and using it for its expressiveness definitely requires you to go out of your way to do it, which means that if I'm not using it with either proprietary software or just compatible software, I'm not getting the most out of it, and so I just kind of stopped bothering with it for the most part. And then of course the pandemic hit and we were all at home all the time, and so I just completely forgot it existed from there. So I do enjoy it. It's got some jank to it. I don't like the phone app, at least on Android, at all, but I am glad that I have it. I've gotten a lot of use out of it, just not necessarily for the reasons that Rolly thought I would. So I hesitantly recommend it if you want a small flexible MIDI controller, but the 5D MIDI is just a gimmick in my opinion. Real quick, I do want to mention that there's a chance that by the time this comes out, Artifon will already have sent me the Orba 2 to review, but regardless, that's not happened yet at the time that I'm filming, and if it had, I wouldn't have had it long enough to do like an updated review, so if I ever do a part 2, you'll see that pop up. But at the time of filming, the final thing to mention, the final bit of hardware to mention is the Roland MC707, the most expensive item on this list by far. This is another one that I initially wouldn't have bought for myself, and it took a bit of extra time to integrate itself into my regular music production pipeline. But once it did, it kind of clicked in a way that doesn't always happen with new gadgets. Like, it clicked in such a way that the pipeline from idea to live jam to fully polished mixed song has become crystal clear in my brain, and I've been able to kind of harness its Roland sound to make some music that I am genuinely incredibly proud of. Some of my favorite music I've made in the past year or so. Would I buy one for myself now? It's very hard to say, especially because right now it and the Akai Force are kind of fighting it out for my attention. The MC707 has much better synthesis engines than the Akai Force does, but the Akai Force has equal or better jamming capabilities. So they're definitely different experiences. I want to be clear, the MC707 is a lot more rigid and more traditional as far as groove boxes go, and the Akai Force is a lot more like Ableton in a box. Those are still fighting it out for my love and attention right now, and obviously I'm just going to keep them both because I'm lucky enough to be able to do that. I don't have to worry about trying to sell one or anything like that. And since Roland sent me the MC707, I don't know what the ethics are on selling that anyway, and I'm just gonna not. Regardless, I'm really glad to have this one in my arsenal because it is almost like a Circuit Pro to me, where it's a very traditional groovebox experience, but with hands-on sound design, more tracks, a good jamming experience, and audio over USB. And that's pretty much everything I want in a groovebox, other than, of course, portability. But there are some problems I've run into during long-term use. First of all, I still don't love the pads. They don't feel great, but I mentioned that in my initial review. The other thing that I didn't notice as much and have now run into is hitting my voice limit a lot sooner than I initially expected. You would expect that something with 8 tracks would have enough voices to accommodate these giant arrangements, but it only has 128 voices, and those get gobbled up very quickly, especially if you have multiple oscillators in each of your synth tracks, which is what I ran into. Like, the sound design process is kind of menu divey. I personally am fine with it, and I still like doing it, although I'll probably 50-50 reach for a preset and tweak it, and then the other times just design a sound completely from scratch. But regardless, I do enjoy designing sounds from scratch on the MC707. It's one of my favorite ways to come up with new song ideas on it, and my temptation is to start filling up every available oscillator slot on every synth. And if you're playing big chord stacks with a ton of oscillators stacked on top of each other, you're going to eat up your voices fast, and you're going to start to get voice stealing, and you're going to start to have to either use fewer tracks or start cutting oscillators, either in the presets or the patches that you've made. That can actually get really annoying to deal with because you've got this nice, expensive device with all of this sonic potential, and then as you're making music on it, you're having to slowly scale back your ambitions and rein in your voice usage so that you don't start having voice stealing. And it does make dealing with the device more frustrating because it's so pricey and so powerful, and yet not quite as powerful as it like presents itself as initially being. And you're like, in the year of our Lord 2022, you'd think that something could just handle a bit more that you throw at it. But other than that complaint, I still really enjoy using it, and I still very much see just jams with it popping up on this channel from time to time. I try to cycle through devices fairly evenly, and inevitably it's not very even, but overall the 707 is still a device that I would count among my favorites for live jamming with the express purpose of making full, polished songs with very specific tonal characteristics. So that is the current list of gear as it stands in late June 2022. None of the gear on this list is bad. It's all at least pretty good, but it has a pretty wide variance of usage from me. The ones I use most off camera would probably be the circuits, and then the Microfreak, and then the MC707, then the Microcosm, then the Microlab, although I consider it an indispensable utility, so that ain't going nowhere. And then at the very bottom, the poor MPC Studio, unloved because of its big brother, the MPC-1. And at this point, you may have noticed that I've gone through 4 of the biggest companies that make some of my favorite music production gear: Arturia, Akai, Novation, and Roland. And that's such a cool position to be in, and only possible thanks to you guys, which is why my allegiance is to you guys first. Always remember, companies are not your friends. They are not my friend, but they have made some cool stuff, and hopefully I've been able to provide some objective, real-world user info based on what they've sent me and keep that perspective, and I definitely want to try to keep that perspective moving forward. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see that circuit, tracks, and rhythm re-review, you can click or tap up over here, and if you'd like to see some more videos, you can click or tap up over here. Thank you so much for watching once again, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.